In my previous video, I compared Paul Atreides to Luke Skywalker, discussing the various similarities between the characters and the significant differences between them, examining the different ethical systems each character is used to explore. I came to the conclusion that while the characters share much on the surface, substantively they're very different. I also mentioned that the Star Wars character with more substantive similarities to Paul Atreides is Anakin Skywalker. There's a lot more shared between these characters, with tragedy embedded in their stories. However, I'd argue Anakin's story feels more tragic than Paul's, not simply because Anakin suffers more in his story, but for reasons a bit deeper. So let's get into that. To start with, what are some of the obvious similarities between Paul and Anakin? Well, each character is at the centre of a mythic prophecy, telling of a figure who will be revolutionary for certain groups. Anakin is theorised to have been created by the Force itself. Because of this, and his strong natural connection to the Force, he's thought by the Jedi to be the Chosen One, the one who will destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force. Paul is born of Duke Leto and Lady Jessica, the Bene Gesserit witch. The Bene Gesserit manufactured a myth about the Kwisatz Haderach, a messiah figure who will come to lead the Fremen and wield great power, and Paul arrives to fill that role. Both Paul and Anakin carry the burden of the expectations for these prophecies from those around them. There's scrutiny on the characters by their elders because of what's expected from them, and it influences their behaviour. It's a spectre of judgment that constantly looms over them. Both characters succumb to vengeful impulses and struggle to resist the pull of hate. Anakin takes revenge on the Sand People who killed his mother by slaughtering all of them, confessing this to Padme afterwards and proclaiming his hatred for them. Anakin also allows himself to fall into an abyss of hatred for the Jedi, who he'd always had a contentious relationship with, as their leadership always treated him with suspicion and judgment. This submission to hatred is one of the things that leads to Anakin's turn to the dark side and transformation into a tyrant. Paul's relationship with hatred and revenge is a bit different to Anakin's. While Anakin takes his revenge on his mother's killers immediately, and then has to face the moral and psychological implications of that for the rest of his story, Paul's desire for revenge against those who murdered his father acts as a plot driver for the entire Dune story, motivating most of Paul's actions, and partly pushing him to take on the role of the Kwisatz Haderach, even though he's critical of the way the Bene Gesserit set up the chain of events leading to this. His hatred and desire for revenge is much cleaner and more precisely directed than Anakin's. Paul's hatred is what drives him forward, whereas Anakin's relationship with feelings of hate and vengefulness are something he constantly has to battle and suppress, as they get in the way of what the Jedi teach, and ostensibly in the way of him fulfilling the prophecy of the Chosen One. Anakin's hatred ostensibly gets in the way of his prophecy, and Paul's is the thing that pushes him to fulfill his prophecy. In that, you can see the different philosophies embedded within each of these stories, which is another topic I covered more extensively in my last video. Both characters find themselves in settings that present them with morally conflicting and confusing incentives. Paul grapples with the guilt of manipulating the Fremen to use them as his army and claim the revenge he wants against the Harkonnens and Empire, while Anakin struggles with Jedi teachings and restrictions clashing with his desires. He has to keep his marriage to Padme a secret, as it contravenes Jedi rules about forming emotional attachments to others. Of course, ultimately, both Paul and Anakin reach positions of power, Paul toppling the Emperor in the Dune universe and taking his throne, and Anakin as the apprentice of the Emperor in the Star Wars universe. The narrative journeys of both characters can be classified as tragic, given what the characters endure and what they become. But now we get to the root of just why Anakin's story feels more tragic than Paul's, and that's actually not really because of what the characters turn into once taking their dark paths, but it's more to do with the core motivations that lead each of them to their destinations. Fundamentally, I think it comes down to the fact that Paul is motivated by hate fate to become the dark figure he becomes, whereas Anakin, in spite of grappling with and being influenced by his intense feelings of hate and anger, is primarily motivated by love. Paul aims to seize power because he wants to use it to inflict his revenge upon his enemies, but Anakin primarily aims to seize power to protect the person he loves. He's haunted by dreams of his wife Padme dying, premonitions like he experienced about his mother before she was killed, and he can't stand the thought of losing Padme like he lost his mother, and so he will do whatever's necessary to stop that happening. He makes a Faustian bargain with Palpatine to gain forbidden knowledge about how to use the Force to stop people from dying. The cost at his end of this bargain is the slaughter of the Jedi and assistance in the overthrowing of the Republic. He has tragic flaws that make him susceptible to being seduced by the dark side, such as his overconfidence in himself and his yearning for power in general, but ultimately, what he cares about most is the people he loves. Anakin's story is tragic for many reasons, one of which being that he fails in what he set out to do. He sacrifices all he knows to save Padme, and still loses her anyway. She's horrified at the discovery of what he did for her, and ends up dying as a result of the actions he took. He brings about the event he was trying so desperately to prevent, through the actions of trying to prevent it. In contrast, Paul succeeds in his vengeance quest, claiming power as a ruler too. Even though his rise to power ends on an ominous note in Dune, it feels triumphant, because he's succeeded in everything he set out to do. Imagine if Anakin succeeded in overthrowing the Jedi and in saving Padme, so he and she raised Luke and Leia from the comfort of their imperial privilege. It would feel different. Still dark and disturbing, but more emotionally ambiguous, given the Jedi did impose some pretty psychotic mandates on those in their ranks, and treated Anakin like an outsider since he was a child. The Dune story is not primarily about personal, tragic descent into evil, like Anakin's story in Star Wars, but more about the overarching danger of following charismatic figures uncritically. In that regard, the lessons to draw from the story are less about the choices Paul makes and where those choices lead him, and more about the system surrounding him that leads him to make his choices, the machine he's a cog in. Whereas Anakin's story is a traditional tragedy, like Othello, Hamlet, Dr. Faustus, and so follows the dramatic principles of such stories, making his descent into villainy feel more tragic. But what do you think? Do you agree with the argument I've made here, or do you have a different take? Let me know in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.